Back in the 1st century AD, especially perhaps among the Jewish race, who you were in the sense of your pedigree and background defined you perhaps more than it tends to today. People had already asked questions about who Jesus was when they heard what he had to say. "Isn't this the carpenter's son?" people in his hometown asked disbelievingly. Such a background as that could surely not have produced this strangely unnerving, incomprehensible person. And as he continued to attract even more attention, so the speculation about him grew. Trying to figure him out in the light of a well-known family history, people were, well, flummoxed. When miracles followed the outspokenness, they began to look for other explanations. Greatness, if that's what it was, couldn't just come from nowhere. The disciples enjoyed the popular guessing game at first. After all, the very highest flown ideas about Jesus' pedigree could only add to their kudos as his apprentices. But when Jesus asks them who they think he really is, it's not for idle curiosity's sake. He wants to test their understanding, not hear the speculation of the largely self-interested crowd. He rather puts them on the spot. "Our Pete only ever opened his mouth to change his sandals. They'd always been the same. Mouth in motion before engaging brain, that were his signature manoeuvre. I were his elder brother, but that didn't mean I could stop him, even slow him down. It were predictably a snap decision, leaving our family business along with Jim and John. But it's a wonder the master took him on, him being so quick on the catapult. He did have his moments though. Folks thought I envied Pete I mean, being Jesus' right-hand man, but he'd always been charismatic. We were like John and Jim really. Brothers aren't always alike. John were deep and thoughtful. Jim, why, not so much. I were cautious, while our kid were a trailblazer. He jumped at Jesus' invitation that day by the lake. Rest of us just followed suit. Our last couple of years with Jesus had been pretty full on. Enormous, determined crowds trailing round after him. He did the impossible. People responded. The hero worshipped or hated his guts. He mightn't have a rabbi or a scribe's credentials, but he'd more idea about God than the whole blooming lot of them put together. He mightn't be uptight enough for the farisados of the temple high hats, but he knew what mattered, who mattered. And he acted accordingly, speaking his mind. Well, God's. Obviously, people were curious, wherever he looked like. However average his family were, he were no ordinary bloke. Everywhere we went, and boy, did we cover some ground. We'd hear one daft theory after another about who he was. John the Dipper, back from the dead. That was ridiculous. John was still dipping all comers when Jesus began his campaign. Then it got silly. Elijah too seemed top of the poll. But Moses and Isaiah, they all were in there. He might have been God's latest PR and marketing bod, but he wasn't just recycling stuff from centuries back. He were a one-off, completely new. Then, one night over supper, Jesus asked us what people are saying about him. That were odd. He didn't normally care. We all chipped in with the popular theories, but he stops us in full floor and asks our honest opinions. Nobody wanted to say out then. Roll up, see who can look the biggest fool. Oh, it were always going to be Pete, opening his gob to swap feet. But when he said, "You are the Messiah," you could have knocked the rest of us down with a feather. God's long anointed, promised leader and deliverer? I don't think it had entered my head. Jesus quoted Isaiah right enough, quite often, but hearing that word, it were a shock. Still, weren't as bad of what came next, sigh Pete. When Jesus started on about his destiny, about being rejected and suffering and dying. Forget that last bit, weird, about him rising again. I suppose Pete were on a high because Jesus hadn't denied he was the Messiah, just told us we must keep it under our headcloths. Okay. But how could Jesus, if he were God's chosen one, be killed? Pete said it, but we're all thinking the same. Surely the whole point was the Messiah comes out on top, overthrows the non-believers and the hypocrites. But suddenly, Jesus is jumping down Pete's throat with his hobnail boots on. Satan, he called him, telling him he was thinking in purely worldly terms from a totally human perspective. Poor Pete. He looked like a kicked puppy. And later on, Jesus started telling the crowds they would have to set aside selfish concerns and take up their crosses if they seriously wanted to follow him. Oh, that were a proper crowd pleaser. They were to give up their lives. What? Out of nowhere came a tipping point. Of course, that same evening after supper, Jesus tells us this story round the fire about how God sent his only Son, and in the wilderness Satan, God's sworn enemy, were trying to turn him. It were all about choosing human comforts, necessities, weaknesses over God, about having us own way instead. It were not just sigh. Jesus wanted us all to be more realistic about the way ahead. Sacrifices, self-sacrifices. They must pave the way for God's kingdom. Somewhat odd happened just a few days later though. Sigh. Pete, he never said till after. Jesus had took him, John and Jim, up this big mountain. They had some mind-blowing vision. It were Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus, with him shining like the midday sun. That changed him, you know. I think he were really afraid then. He saw it all coming apart and knew how Jesus were in grave danger. And he knew more than ever that Jesus absolutely was the promised, if rather different, Messiah. It were a startling oil lamp moment, a watershed. Nothing would ever be the same when the pieces of that puzzle came together, and for us bystanders, family likeness started to become more obvious. While Si and I, John and Jim, well, we were utterly different, Jesus and his Father were almost as alike, as identical twins. To know one meant you'd seen the other. The denarius drops for the big bold fisherman right slap bang in the middle of Mark's short gospel. While we are privileged, like some pantomime audience, to see what's really going on, the first witnesses were in the dark about Jesus. Yes, people did ask questions, but almost nobody seemed to have a clue. And it seems that was pretty much how Jesus wanted it. Perhaps he was playing for a little more time when he told them not to talk. Jealousy and insecurity, self-interest and pride, even downright cruelty, all would work to suppress God's novel mission from within humankind. If they had but suspected Jesus' true pedigree, the corrupt and resistant might have acted more quickly, preventing even the seeds from being sown. From this pivotal moment, then, Mark's Jesus turns towards his cross. He's navigating by God's mysterious map, where an X will mark the spot for the finding of eternal treasure. It endorses Peter's discovery for good and all. God loves humankind this much.